Hi, welcome to this Open Security Summit in March 2022. And here we got Lewis, who's going to talk us about doing compliance differently, especially doing the whole policy as codes, which is really how we should be scaling this. You know, what a great way to end a really amazing day of sessions. Over to you, Lewis.
Thank you very much, Dennis. Pleasure being here. I'll introduce myself in a second. The important thing I wanted to say beforehand is if you want to state a question, just raise your hand or start typing in the chat, and I have it open, so I'll be able to look at it right here. So feel free to interrupt if you have any questions, rather sooner than later. The topic today is doing compliance differently, how to handle your policies as code, and how to get evidence-based compliance through some level of automation. This is a topic I have been pondering a lot over the last few months, I would say, because I'm just in this transition. So I would like to tell a little bit about my journey in this sense and what I see are the potentials here for pretty much anyone who is willing to take this path. So I developed software for a long while, right after university. I was a security consultant afterwards, and then I started working for a large German automotive manufacturer. And among other things, I introduced ASBS as the policy for application security and did a lot around threat modeling as well. And now I work at a renewable wind energy company. We develop, in the company I work for right now, we develop wind turbines for eolic energy generation. And again, I have introduced ASBS, at least in the scope of the teams I cater for as a security architect for their application security requirements. And this has allowed me to think a lot about ASBS and how policies are created, maintained, and updated throughout their life cycle. Because one of the things I did when introducing ASBS was contribute to the OWASP chapter, a way to create the policies by the click of a button to generate from Markdown the PDFs and the JSON and XML representations. I mean, the scripts were already there. What was missing was creating a compilation environment, if you want to call it that way, for LaTeX to create the PDFs and have PDFs that actually look nice. So that's something I did, and that's something that I would like to, that has been an inspiration for me on the course of this thought process. So what I would like to work with you is how does policy creation look like today? Then I did some Wardley Map analysis on both the creation and the consumption of policies, and then how to go about automating compliance, even though it's not really, it's so bleeding edge that there's nothing really out there that's doing it for you right now. So policy creation today. This might be something that resounds with you, right? Depending on the industry you work for, you might have one or more industry norms, regulations you have to abide to. That means that you have a bunch of people in different departments, perhaps, looking at them and creating internal policies for data protection, GDPR, privacy or security, ISO 27001, or if you're more into the industrial sector, ISA, what is it, 62443, or automotive, 21443. There's many of them, right? So every policy or every norm, every legislation that comes out there, UNECE, for example, for the automotive, needs to be translated, adapted, and dumped into a document. Now, what is the degree of overlap between a document in the first folder with a document in the second folder with a document in the third folder? And how do this poor Chuck here go about finding the requirements that are really necessary for the scope of the work that this person or this team or this project has planned? And that's a horrible position, right? Because if you have to go to a share file or to, I don't know, some other document repository and just do a query for security, and you are served 20 to 60 documents, each document between 3 and 100 pages, how much time of your life are you going to invest in figuring out which requirements? And then how do you go about the requirements? Do you just dump them into a Jira ticket, all of them, each one of them? Do you wait until the very end when you have to demonstrate compliance to kind of scratch whatever you can out of your project and see whether you meet the you must be this told to write barrier, maybe get an acceptance because you didn't think of right to delete from GDPR? And how do these poor people go about checking compliance? How do they know that they're being told the truth? How do they know that the check mark they see in a security control that has to be implemented is actually effective? Or when was it implemented? And whether it was implemented? If they don't ever look at the code, they just are overwhelmed. It's a very unfair battle because there's 100 development teams and there's only like 10 people working for all of these departments combined. So how many projects can these projects pipe through, and how many can they actually prove? It's very unfair. So what are the choke points that we have? Of course, finding the right requirements, demonstrating compliance to these requirements, and validating the compliance demonstration that is presented by the teams is the most important thing. And I mean, this is I think very well known. I think everyone who has written a policy at any time in their lifetimes or have contributed to one know how difficult this is. So you have PDFs, Excel sheets, questionnaires that simply don't scale, because the real world data, that's what actually happened to the system when it was being created, is just not there. It's just not getting written down into the Excel sheet at the time it has been implemented. If at all, it was captured in a Jira ticket, in a Azure DevOps board, or any other ticketing engine that the teams are using. And it might be disjoint. It's not really easy to parse it or to query it. And then, of course, you have many disjoint policies. And then for demonstrating compliance, every single group will come up with a different thing. So, for example, one data protection team will say, oh, we're using this SaaS solution, OneTrust. Whereas another team will say, oh, no, you have to demonstrate compliance by filling out this beautiful Excel sheet with 300 entries. And it goes all the way from A to A, B in the columns. So you have to fill out a humongous Excel sheet that no one ever reads. And of course, Word files where data goes to die, right? So who is reading the Word files? How are they being kept? How is the relationship among all projects who answer this? No one knows, right? And what do we actually need from these policies? So I would like to have different views for the policies so that the auditor gets a checklist and can go and go through the checklist. The developer gets a very detailed description, maybe in TDD or in Gherkin, sorry, not in TDD, in Gherkin, telling this group of consumers, this is what you need to do. This is how you pass the test input validation for files or file input validation. I would like to integrate my policy requirements with my ticketing engine. Why not? What's keeping me from, why do I have to receive a PDF with 100 pages when I could get 100 tickets in the Jira engine that I will just work throughout the life cycle of a project? And we also need to understand that there's just-in-time requirements. I have a sprint where I am creating a form and I will be uploading files, and I need a very concrete set of requirements versus I have a project and I have to have these different quality gates for assuring a given security level all along, right? These are long-lived requirements versus just-in-time requirements. And I want the answers to these questionnaires to be based on data. I want them to be fact-based so that I can have a real risk-based assessment afterwards. So I started doing a little bit of Wardley Map thinking aloud for policies, and basically I redraw the image to identify areas of opportunity. So the policy creator, the group behind the policies, is dependent on the external norms and legislations, which will be adapted to create a statement of compliance and a policy. So many times, not every time, the creator of a policy also gives a statement of compliance, which is kind of like another deliverable that the teams need to fill out whenever they're done with all the requirements. So in the end, it's all about creating policies. For a policy, I need to create the policy. For creating the policy, I need content. I need versioning, which needs files. And of course, files need to be stored. I have a common format, PDF, Word, Excel sheet, whatever not, JSON. I need to store it, backup it. I need to edit it. And these are all pretty standard things. But here's the interesting thing. So you will see I have here two, what are they called? Barriers, so some friction in the Wardley map for evolution. So the first one of them is, no, editor is the text editor, right? So to create a policy, you need to type it somewhere. That's what I mean with editor, not the role editor, but the actual thing you're using to edit, right? So you could be using Word, you could be using VI, you could be using Emacs, you could be using your web browser, right? So that's the idea behind it. So my policies depend on, in the end, I will write a file using an editor, and I will write content in a given format. Now the format is very ad hoc. It's in the genesis phase. What that means is every policy looks different from every other policy in the company. Yes, they most all have perhaps the same sections, but sometimes they have tables, sometimes they have just statements, sometimes they have examples. So every policy is a work of art. And the versioning, if you have ever helped create a policy, you know this is, together with merging, a headache, because most groups creating policies are working with Word. Now, if you have ever tried to merge the work of 3 or 4 people in a Word file, you know what level of pain that means. I've seen people spend more than a week merging 4 ways. So the same document from 4 different stakeholders with their comments, so that there could be a meeting to discuss the comments. And when you look at it closely, you see, okay, I have content, I have versioning, I have merging. Does that resemble something that you know of? And I think that the answer is yes, versioning. Well, wasn't there this Git thing where we can version, merge, and keep everything kind of in sync? Yeah, but it really works only if you're doing it text-based, which means now the file format that we will be using will probably change. We can still use Word if we want to, but it might not be the best editor for this. So there might be a lot of friction in adapting to working with Git, because it's an audience that has never worked with something like that. So I have the pleasure of working with some colleagues which have more of a lawyer background, so legal background for data protection in the company I work for right now. And I am teaching them how to use Git. so that they can create policies that can be maintained as code. And it has on top of that, it has the advantage of being able to assign tasks, because if you're using a platform like GitHub or GitLab, they have already this ticket creation and I mean, it's not Jira, of course, but it has some level of workflows where you can have discussions around items and assign the items to people in the work group. So you can have all your merging, your discussions, everything, which is great for compliance, for the ISMS, in one place. You can demonstrate why every statement in your policy came to be as it was based on the discussion by which people at which point in time, and have the different versions of every single file. So this is the first evolution I see. But of course, it's an evolution that requires a very steep learning curve for the usual audience creating policies. And the second thing I see is once you go that way, you might want to rethink how you're writing your policies, not the editor part of it, but more the format, how you format the text. Why? Because some formats are more conducive to having the possibility of transforming your code, your markdown, if you want, into JSON or XML or another format. And that is exactly how OWASP ASVS is doing it, right? They have a very strict layout where they have the pros in the beginning of each chapter and subchapter in each section. And then they have every single statement about compliance in a table that has a very strict formatting. And every single statement goes in there like that. And that you can parse, transform into JSON, and then transform it again. And that's, I think, the right time to show where innovation can come in. Because getting this far is not really innovation per se. The innovation comes when you start adopting another standard called OSCAL, which comes from NIST, Open Security Compliance. Sorry, I need to go to, I don't even know the acronym. I'm terribly sorry about that. So this is the webpage from OSCAL. And I don't think they even show what the acronym stands for. Open Security Controls Assessment Language. That's it. Open Security Controls Assessment Language, OSCAL. So once you start, and the biggest problem is that OSCAL cannot hold the pros. So you cannot use OSCAL to create the nice PDFs that you still need to have to demonstrate that you have policies. But you can translate something that like formatted like OWASP ASVS into OSCAL here to have your policy as code, which allows us to create system profiles and audience-based policies or audience-based extracts of the policies, to be more precise. So this is the point where it gets really interesting, because if I am able to create system profiles, I can define for a system of a given integrity or assurance level which security controls need to apply. And OSCAL is designed so that you can reduce overlap between competing policies. So in the process of creating these profiles, you can make sure that you are compliant with ISO 27001, ISA 62443, or any other GDPR or any other one you want to add on top, because all of these, they have overlapping controls. So there's no need to pull from 10 different policies and figure out that out of the 300 requirements, you already have 50 overlapping ones because someone has figured that one out for you. There's no need to keep on repeating this job every single time, right? So to summarize the points I'm trying to make on this phase of policy creation, if you create your policies in a structured way, for example, like ASBS in Markdown, and I have here an example of how it looks like, in which you have your section, your requirement, description, and the assurance level it applies to, and some extra metadata like the CWE you're trying to address with it. Now, if you do this, you will face some inertia, as I pointed out before, right? So the first point of inertia or friction is Git. If you're trying to get lawyers, mechanical engineers, or people that don't necessarily write software to use Git, it takes a lot of patience, and it's also rewarding, but there's a steep learning curve. Perhaps we know how just to use it because we've been using it for so long, but not everyone has, right? You also need to learn how to format in Markdown, which is not terrible, but I think the most difficult thing is we have always done it this way. That's always we have always used Word files. We have always kept it this way. Why should we have to change? And another point, which might be very tricky to get across the group, we have always done it this way, is to use a CI/CD pipeline for your policies. If you make changes to the code of the policy, so to the Markdown of the policy, why can't you just automatically create a pipeline that generates a new JSON dump of it, which generates a new PDF version out of it, and which can be cascaded all the way to the published status or have it in an intermediate state? And there's another problem right now, which is how do you go from this to OSCAL, which is basically you have to write your own parser. So let's say someone writes a parser for ASBS. That means you have to write every single policy from now on in the same fashion. So it makes sense in the context of your company or the group you work for to consider which format do you want to keep. Do you want to keep each statement as an individual statement with some metadata added to it? It's up to you, right? But then whatever you do, it needs to be consistent with a schema that can be translated into to create an OSCAL catalog. Any questions, any comments so far? Before I move on. Seems not. Okay, so now the fun part is once you have this created, you can think of how to automate compliance. So if you can generate your policies and you can dump your policies as statements, what do you need? Yeah, how to use OSCAL. Yeah, exactly. That's that's a good trick. I'm in this journey, right? So I don't have the answers for how to use OSCAL right now. So the NIST website states a couple of states a few resources. Some of them are open source. Some of them are the freemium version of some commercial product. The OSCAL itself is free, so you can read it. You can go to GitHub. You can pull it down. You can look for it. So it's a fantastic thing, right? There's conferences that are meant to be OSCAL, and I know that's a very long comment from Ben. And the only example I could find was that of the 853 revision 5, which is the latest security controls NIST document. So the problem is ISO 27001 cannot be published because it's proprietary data. So you basically have to go through the effort yourself, unless the ISO group starts selling ISO standards also as JSON in OSCAL format, which could be great. But probably you need to do this translation step yourself for creating a catalog. And from the catalog, creating your profiles. But the idea here is if you have the possibility of generating baselines per assurance class and component type and whatever else you want to filter, why can't we go the other way around? You generate the tickets, or you generate the requirements on demand. How can you go about getting the data on demand from the governance side to figure out who is compliant and not before they even go to a quality gate meeting, if you have quality gates in your development, right? Okay, I thought I had done an intermediate version of it. Apparently I didn't. So basically we find some of the same elements. Of course, obviously we need to find the same elements, else it will be very hard. So now we have the policy checker, alias the auditor, and the policy consumer, alias poor Chuck, who has to read 100 documents. And what they need is a statement of compliance, which depends on a policy, which depends on requirements, which depend on a certain content being there. And we said, okay, we have policy as data. Policy as data allows me to have system profiles, and system profiles will depend on activities and tickets. So I call tickets the requirements that are created, right? So system profiles require you to generate tickets and activities that can be fed into the ticketing engine or the CI/CD pipeline for the statement of compliance as well. So the statement of compliance requires a compliance engine which is fed through the ticket engines and the CI/CD pipeline to check whether the security activities, your SAST, your TAST, everything is taking part, which means you as a security person have to write the code to check through the API of Azure DevOps boards or whatever you're using, parse the YAML definition files of the pipelines and figure out which ones are using the defined security activities or not. So this is something I'm doing right now, which saves me a lot of work of having to go to every single development group and ask them, what's the status of compliance of your pipeline? I know I have 220 pipelines, and I know that out of these 220 pipelines, a certain percentage have all the security checks, and a very large percentage have one or less than one of the security checks that we want. Now, I can create transparency on that because I am writing the compliance engine that goes and checks this information. And I can also check the tickets that are created from the requirements engine based on the system profile. The requirements engine is writing tickets and is writing tickets and into the ticketing engine with a certain tag. Now I can read this tag and I know whether a certain requirement has been implemented or not from the compliance engine. And that makes my statement of compliance evolve into an advanced state, because now I don't have to bother people to write a statement of compliance or fill out an enormous checklist, because I have the evidence. I have the ticket numbers, I have the minimum mean time to resolve of vulnerabilities, open tickets, everything I have. And it's right here where we can see that in this compliance engine and this requirements engine, that we can see the future of compliance developing. So as who was asking, Susan was asking, how do we use OSCAL? Well, I think that's the bleeding edge right now. So there's a format defined, and on top of that, we will start seeing some development on both how to generate engines, how to generate requirements, and in the future, maybe through plugins or some other thing, how to read out of your ticketing engine and your CI/CD pipeline the information you need to fill out the statement of compliance. So in order to automate compliance, there's a new message, sorry. OSCL will enable mapping across other standard frameworks. Yes, of course. I mean, OSCL is the glue across all possible frameworks, right? OSCL allows you to take ISO norms, legislation, US critical infrastructure, European critical infrastructure laws, requirements, map them out, see how much overlap they have, and boom, you have exactly what you need based on the profile. So you can filter based on the area in the world where you will be deploying, assurance level, component types even, and you can start mixing and matching, right? So the idea is, let's try to evaluate policies based on system profiles. OSCL profiles are created, and here the inertia will be, first of all, to create these profile models. There will be a tendency to build versus buy, so it's a bleeding edge. Some groups will try, I see maybe the Facebooks and the Netflixes of the world creating custom systems that they might open source later on, or commercial companies popping up selling this service or serving this as a software as a service solution. But here, perhaps the most important thing will be to have the policy creator acceptance. So again, I have a group which is very close to OT security, which is reading the 62443 ISA IEC norm. And I have a disjoint group, which is the cybersecurity group, which is reading ISO 27001 or 2. Having them agree on the policy, on the profile model will be the challenging part. And that's where the system security plan comes, right? Because here you can start mixing and matching different profiles, different catalogs. So you can pick from different catalogs based on legislation, again, based on norms you want to comply with, which catalogs you take in, which profiles you take in, and that allows you to create your system security plan. And perhaps the biggest inertia point here will be the existing governance team acceptance. Will they accept to use it? Will they accept this rather than their Excel sheet, which they have pampered and caressed for a decade? That's a difficult discussion to have. Not one that is without merit, of course, but it requires some level of humans talking to humans and not only machines doing the work, right? But in the end, you might end up with an assessment plan or an assessment results plan, which can substitute your Excel sheets. And that's the idea behind this whole project, right? OSCL, to get rid of this. So I wish I could tell you a lot more about OSCL right now, but I discovered it. I mean, I remembered OSCL not only last week. So I was preparing this presentation, and I was thinking, I cannot be the only person in the world who has thought of this before. Of course not. Now I found OSCL. Maybe in the next summit session, if there's interest, I'll present more a lot about OSCL. But right now, I think there's a lot of potential here, and I think we will see a very strong evolution on the market for compliance to move away from Excel sheets and Word files and PDFs towards a more structured way of giving requirements and checking requirements. So if you ask me, how do I envision this right now in the next year or a year and a half happening in the company I work for? I am working with several groups, teaching them how to use Git, transforming how they work on policies to use Markdown so that we can start treating policies as code. Now, we're storing this in GitLab or GitHub, whatever you're using, it doesn't really matter. From this, using the exact same environment I donated to OWASP ASVS, we can generate the PDF on the one hand side. On the other hand side, we can feed requirements into an intelligent engine. So right now, the intelligent, not so intelligent engine I have chosen is SKF, Security Knowledge Framework. Not because it's the best one, but because it's there and it already works with ASBS out of the box. So there's a need to adapt it and maybe make it understand OSCAL, or maybe look at one of the open source OSCAL definitions. But this is something I'm working on. But the most important thing is, once I get these requirements, what I want to do desperately is inject all applicable requirements to the Jira board or the Azure DevOps board that my customers, the policy customers, are working with. Not the disjoint one, their own. Why? Because then I know they're working on it. Now, I can go and look for evidence that they're actually working on the requirements and meeting all the security activities at the source. I have created a script right now that goes and looks into Azure DevOps boards, Azure DevOps APIs, and I just get all the YAML files from all pipelines, and I parse it to see whether they have the approved tools for them for the whole process. And I have started creating transparency on this and reporting, and the reports should increment to reflect threat modeling and security requirements per sprint based on the scope of work, which will allow us to perhaps reduce by a great deal the time spent in the company filling out forms, because when the data is there. And now we can just basically create an autobahn, a highway for those that are doing everything from the very beginning. We just wave them through, versus a bumpy road for those that are not doing anything and might have to go through a risk acceptance process or a very long number of repetitions. And perhaps most people will decide to go through the autobahn, the freeway, at some point, which will make life for regulators, our customers, and our internal, external auditors a lot faster, a lot easier. And with that, I'm not sure if there are any comments or questions. So the conclusion is, I'm convinced that policies can be created and treated as code. So I'm not yet saying how to translate them into something that can be checked on Terraform. I'm not yet at that level of detail. I'm saying the statements, the document that you have today somewhere in your company as a PDF that's very dead, no one looks at it, can be treated as code. You have to involve your stakeholders for them to buy in. Serving policy requirements doesn't have to hurt. There's no need for someone to spend 3 days or a week reading through requirements, because you know that is lost lifetime, that it's not coming back. You need the requirements you need when you need them and nothing else. And assessing compliance in an automated fashion will certainly be met with some pushback. It will require discipline from developing teams in tagging their tickets, but that's something that can be worked with teams as you enroll them into this automatic compliance process. And of course, that means maybe the governance function, the people in the governance team might need to do a little bit of coding until there are bespoke systems that can do this for you. But right now, at the bleeding edge of tech, there's no way you can move forward without getting your hands dirty in some code. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm open for questions, discussions, anything you would like to add. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Luis. Is there any question from anyone? Ben is asking to mute. Yes, Ben, please.
Yeah, give me a second. I thought that how a policy creator write down a policy to be understood by the developer is a bigger issue than automation. Yes, there's a project I have been contributing with Mario Plat called, I don't even know, Gherkin ASVS or something like that. So we are translating ASVS into Gherkin to make it very clear to developers what they need to do. So if I'm so maybe Ben can start asking his question. I'll look very briefly to see if I can find it in a, or give me a second. I'll find it in github.com. Let me just. Saludos a Perú, Gerardo. Give me just a second. Okay, give me a second. My repository show more.
No, it's just a comment, Luis, that
Yes.
the Center for Internet Security, I was talking to them last week, and they're also looking very seriously at publishing in OSCAR. So that because then you can really, what you want to do is be able to absorb all these different standards. I mean, obviously, ISO have a difficulty with their publishing model. 150 Swiss francs for every standard, but it's how you consume that. That isn't the problem with ASVS, but it's how you get this in a form you can start to consume it if you want to be able to link these and generate tests for the developers.
Yes, that has to be the future. I cannot imagine keeping on consuming only the PDF version of it. I mean, the PDF is great for getting an overview for the governance group, but there's no one reading the full ISO 27002.
Yeah, some of us, but I mean, the issue is that you need to filter it and give just what you need for the developer for their task. Oh, great, you found it.
Yeah, so this is Gerardo, what I was saying. So for example, chapter 12 from the ASVS is file and resources. So for example, we have created scenarios. Do not accept large files. So if your application has an upload capability and you have set the maximum file size, if a file exceeds this maximum file size, then you fail and you log a message and so on and so on. And here you have file type validation and a lot more things. So I mean, if you want to take a look, I'll just link it here. This is my own personal version, but it's a fork from the OWASP, Open Security Summit. So within the Open Security Summit in the past, we have created this. I'm not exactly sure that Chef inspec is exactly the same thing. I did look at Chef inspec in the past, Fabrizio. I have the impression that Chef inspec would be the outcome of it, right? Because you don't consume Chef inspec policy. So having an OSCAL set of requirements that can translate into a Chef inspec policy that can be checked in the system of scope, in the target of evaluation, that is probably where it is going. But I would lie if I tell you I have Chef inspec very fresh in my mind right now. I looked at it about a year ago, so I need to look into that as well. And yeah, I mean, it would be great to have ISO standards in OSCAL format, because I have been actually in the past basically PDF dumping ISO standards, then creating some regular expressions to get the line breaks out between sentences, between statements, and just getting all the statements for some of them. So the automotive standards, when it came out, that's one of the things that I did on the first day, right? As soon as I had my hands on it, I basically just translated it into file text, plain text, so that you didn't have to open a lengthy PDF to get the statements and then just put them in some context.
So there's, I mean, these documents tend to be written as a narrative, but the controls, the components of what you want to extract, I know you've done some work to extract those, but if they're written as the components, you can always generate that PDF, because lawyers are not going to read they're not going to read a set of gherkin instructions. They're going to want a narrative document, which you can generate, but you can also use consistently give the same controls out to each developer.
Yeah, that's exactly the idea, right? So the idea is, how can I create different views of the same model? Because now it's all data, right? So my developers, my QA, and my auditors, and my project managers, they might all need different versions of, or different levels of verbosity, right? Yeah. Some of them need examples, some of them don't care about examples, some of them just care whether there's a check in it and not. So that's all that we can do when we start moving away from PDF and Word and start working with data.
And there's another aspect of this, which is the mapping. There's a conversation we had before, which is if you have to meet 4 different audits, or you have to take an audit and relate it to something else. If you've got the mapping between the controls, and all the frameworks have their own mapping, then in combination with this atomized kind of controls, it means you can take a piece of evidence and say where it's equivalent.
Certainly, there's a great, oh God, I lost it. There's a great diagram from OSCAL in which they do exactly this thing with the profiles.
Yeah.
Let me see if I OSCAL NIST and the image search. Give us a second. Where was it?
I think OSCAL is fairly fresh. That's the issue.
Yeah, it's I mean, it's a couple of years old, but I think COVID basically didn't help it to spread around. So there's a couple of RSA conference talks from 2018 and 19, but since there has been like little noise around it, and they just published a new version of the standard not that long ago. I know I can't find it right now, but for example, talking about the tools, they do have a section of tools and libraries to work with it. So you can have JSON, XML representations, and some other things. So I don't know. There's plenty to extract here. It's just I don't know, so fresh. There's little previous art. So I think this is a great topic to invest some time in and make your life a lot more fun, right? So any more questions? I think Sveta says, get version of this presentation be used at the point in time to resolve the policy overlap issue coming from different sources. Yes, Sveta, exactly. That's the idea behind OSCAL. So I don't know. Let me see if I can find the site in the OSCAL website, because there was a very nice image in which they basically mix and match NIST catalog, component definition model. No, I think I'm on the wrong page. I don't know exactly where it is right now. I know I had found it. I don't know why I get to see calcium tablets. This one here. Pardon for me not using it, but the idea is that you can basically start matching and creating for example, a low baseline, and you can start taking security controls from different of these things and start matching them together. So you get rid of the overlap among different standards and laws and legislations. So I think this is perhaps the best part of it. Not sharing the page. Oh God. Pardon. I was looking at the wrong monitor. I know. I mean, it's not only the consulting firms, right? I mean, the company I work for, we sell wind turbines pretty much everywhere in the world. Now, Chinese cybersecurity law, American cybersecurity law, California law, German or European cybersecurity and data protection laws, critical infrastructure, United States versus CRITIS, I think it's called in Germany, versus, I don't know, whatever else you want to look at. I mean, it's just impossible to demonstrate compliance to everything at once. And even if you can, the effort is ad hoc, is a once in a lifetime. There's no way to get this effort being used for something else. There was a great talk in the last AWS reInvent 2021 about compliance at the speed of at the speed of the business or something like that. And they were saying, a line that stuck to my mind was, the effort to do one audit should be the effort to do all audits, which means once you do one audit, basically every single other audit should follow the exact same path, which is you make the effort once to be able to extract information for the audit, and that's it. You never have to redo it because you always have it there. So, I mean, OSCAL is great as a format, but it does not do the harvesting of the data, right? So it's great to be able to get rid of shaft and just keep the single statements that you need from OSCAL. But it's even better if you can spare a lot of human time and suffering going through audits if all this data is in systems that you can just harvest. It's just that they're disjoint systems. You need to have some glue code that joins them all together. So it's still very experimental, but Ben, you can't unmute.
I was just saying that when you actually start looking at these mappings, it's not necessarily that obvious, because you take ASVS, it's very granular, and you take something like CSA, very high level. So I think we also agree some of these controls are orthogonal to each other. So, but they definitely, should be able to be grouped together. And there's lots of subjective mappings, but I think this is a good start.
Yes, I think it's a great start. I mean, I think these are the ideas, right? So if I were to start a business right now, I would probably look into generating this compliance engine that is able to look into Jira, is able to look into the main CI/CD pipelines, and basically just harvest data from these systems. Azure DevOps or whatever AWS's version of that is called. Just harvest the data from the pipelines, harvest the data from the repos, parse it, and make sure that the things are there that you want to see and that they're active, right? It doesn't make sense to have them, but having them deactivated. So that's the state of my thoughts around this topic. And yeah, glad to have the discussion and to have you share. Yeah, automation takes out the tedious work. I agree with you, Susan. Yeah, exactly, right? So what we need is for these folks to interpret and codify these requirements coming from the industry or coming from the legislation in the business areas of the world that we operate in. Once they have this work of translating it into policies, why should we suffer to get them when we need them? And even worse, why do these people and these people need to suffer together to prove that they have been met? So what I'm selling to my colleagues and on this side of the fence internally is, I'm going to make your work, I'm going to automate you out of a job so that you can actually have time to do fun stuff, consulting with the businesses, not just having your calendar paper walls by groups coming demanding for a meeting for some quality gate, because you have the quality gate already. You know the status of it from day one. So yes, I agree with you, Sarah. I think Gerardo was saying AWS are pretty good at releasing PDF compliant documents. Why not switch to code imported in EC2 S3 or whatever? Internally, they do. But that's the shared responsibility model. Now, they do that for themselves to show CSA alliance assessments, SOC 2 type 2 and whatever not. But if you have an EC2 instance, you're responsible for it all the way, right? Operating system, libraries, access, all of it. So I don't think it's in their business line, right? That's where Chef Inspec could come, for example, which is one that is already there now. How do you get the policies from this group of people or from these PDF documents into Chef Inspec to go and generate these certificates of compliance? I don't know. Without something intermediate like OSCAL, it's going to be very hard and very error prone, especially since they change every now and then the version here that will just break your Chef Inspec scripts. Great. Any other questions? Any comments?
No, thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Thank you very much, Luis. I'm going to stop the recording.